Hi, welcome to another IELTS video. In this video, we're going to look at how to understand your academic Task 1 question. If you find this video helpful, visit my blog at ieltscom and visit the forum ieltsnetwork.com. In academic Task 1, you will be required to describe at least one visual data source in writing. As you know, your data source could be one of four types: a graph, a table, a chart, or a diagram. Of course, understanding the data you are being shown is critically important to your ability to produce an accurate response. So today I'd like to look at the four different data sources and talk about key features you should make note of when interpreting the data and preparing yourself mentally to produce a logical representation of the data in English writing. So as you've likely noticed, half the screen is black, and it is in this area that I would like to outline roughly the sort of structure you should be mentally producing for each data source before you actually put your pen to paper and start writing. So as with all IELTS writing tasks, there is no single correct structure to use, and thus we need to be flexible and creative and dynamic, and we need to tailor our response to the data sources that we are presented with. So to start today's lesson, so here we see a straightforward graph. Now, if you see a graph in your IELTS, it will likely either be a bar graph or a line graph, but in any case, graphs describe relationships between two or more pieces of data, and they do this through an X and Y axis. Graphs can also be made to share additional information too, as is exemplified in this graph through the framing of this data over the course of 3 years, 2003, 2004, and 2005, which are color coordinated with the various bars in this graph. So the trick with these sorts of graphs is identifying common trends and grouping them in a manner that is both logical and stylistically sound. So as you've learned before, academic task 1 involves identifying the broad, minor, and minute trends. And in doing this, we are put in a position where we're better able to make logical organization in our written response. So if we look at this graph, the broad trend would be, if we look at across all age groups, the broad trend would be a mild increase, okay, and then somewhat of a plateau, and then a significant decrease in smoking rates as Scottish women age. Now, in our response, we want to reflect this broad detail in the opening or introduction section of our writing. Now, following this, we would want to share the minor trends. Okay, and I won't go through all of the minor trends because there are several, but you would want to notice certain things that can be grouped together, and then group those things together in your written response. So. And then within those minor trends, we punctuate them with minute details. So for example, if we look at this graph, now between 16 years of age, Scottish women that are 16 years of age, between 16 and 59, we see a common value, fairly common. This looks like it might be a little bit lower, but relatively common value for this large age group, and that is in the year 2003. So an idea might be to write a paragraph that describes the information we see in these four age groups, okay? Because we can group the 2003 figure into a single sentence, right? And then we can describe the 2004, and then and 2005 actually is also very logical. It's almost the same between 16 and 44 years of age. So it makes logical sense to perhaps group these four age groups into one paragraph and describe them that way. We would likely group these two figures. We could group these two in their own separate paragraph because they are different. And we might talk about the fact that as women age in Scotland, it doesn't matter what year, 2003, 2004, 2005, as women age in Scotland, the prevalence of smoking declines. So, and that's not the only option we would have available to us. We could describe the data in three paragraphs. One paragraph, designated to a year. So we could have a paragraph for 2003, another paragraph for 2004, and a third one for 2005. So we have several options available to us, and I guess we'd have to go with whatever we would feel most confident doing. And for me, that would be grouping these four age groups and then talking about the data that way. Okay. Pie charts show fractions of a whole and require you to be confident when speaking about percentages. So reviewing the language needed to do this is important, and I advise you to, if you're going to write the academic, ensure that you're comfortable writing and comparing percentages. It is unlikely that you will get a single pie chart. Pie charts are normally coupled with another data source, whether that data source is another pie chart, as we see here, or perhaps a bar graph or a table or even a diagram. So it is important that you recognize the need to establish the relationship that exists between the pie chart and whatever second data source you're given. Now, in our instance here, we are comparing quantities of EU export goods to Brazil and to Russia. Okay, so it reads, the following charts depict EU exports to both Brazil and Russia. Write a report for university lecturer summarizing the information presented. So after giving our opening statement outlining the type of data sources we have been presented with, we would likely take an entire paragraph to analyze the details that we see within this first pie chart, which is EU goods exported to Brazil. And while describing, we might couple certain items that have the same values. So for example, the UK and Belgium, which are both at 7%. Now we would then proceed to a second analyzing paragraph that uses quite a bit of comparative language to reveal details for the second pie chart and how these details, how EU exports to Russia compare to EU exports to Brazil. So it would really be in the second, analyzing paragraph where you would see the heavy comparative language come out. Again, we might, couple certain figures that are the same. So the UK and Belgium are once again the same. Sweden, it's the same as Austria. So when we have these identical figures, we can get away with coupling them into a single sentence, and then we can be much more concise with our language, which helps speed up how quickly we can create this response. And it's considered good style to be as succinct as possible. I should also point out that sometimes if you're given two pie charts, you will be given the same information at two different points in time. That's not the case here, but and then in that instance, you would have to describe what trends can be understood from the graph. Tables are another possible Task 1 data source. Tables often present data that either evolves, like what we see here, the data changes over time, or is cyclical, like for example, a bus schedule or a table depicting annual rainfall patterns. So the language you will need to use in either case differs slightly, and I suggest you practice as much as you can both kinds of language so that you're comfortable with it, and you'd be comfortable using it in your exam. So in this example here, we see data that evolves among 4 countries within the UK over the course of 8 years. Because this particular data source is time sensitive, a lot of the language and strategies we will use here will be similar to those for most graphs. Because as you know, I mean, not all graphs, and not even the graph that we were looking at in this lesson, but many graphs do have time across their x-axis, and they show the manner in which something evolves or develops over the course of months or years or whatever the case may be. So the language is often similar. So we would start this response with a sentence outlining what the data source is and what it is showing, and any broad trends that might be worth noting. As the data among the 4 countries is fairly similar, we could group all data into one large comparison paragraph if we wanted to. Lots of comparative language would be needed to illustrate how the countries compare to one another. I mean, of course, if, say, 2 of these countries were very similar and the other 2 countries were different but similar to each other, then you might consider grouping, say, England and Wales into one paragraph, and that analyzes the manner in which these 2 countries move in relation to each other, if they were similar, I mean. And then Scotland and Northern Ireland the same. I mean, if they were very similar but different from England and Wales, we might group them into a separate paragraph. But in this particular instance, all 4 countries seem to follow fairly similar progression. So we see there is some variation, but for the most part there's growth. I mean, none of the countries finish 2011 lower than their value in 2004, for example. But I mean, there is some variation that you'd have to describe, but on the whole, the countries are somewhat moving in similar direction. We could group certain parts of the data together. So, for example, England's 2004 and 2005 figures and 2006 and 2007 figures, you see it plateaus and then it grows and plateaus again. So we could do what we can to group these together so that we're not having to share, okay, in 2004 the value was 4.7, in 2005 it was 4.7. We can condense everything and make it as concise as possible. And the piece could finish with a reiteration that all 4 countries show similar figures over the period in question, which would be a nice way to finish off the task 1 response. All right. Diagrams can be tricky because they are somewhat unpredictable. Typically, your task 1 diagram will show some kind of process that is either cyclical. So for example, the life cycle of an animal, that would be a cyclical diagram. Or has a clear beginning, middle, and end. So similar to the diagram that we see here. And it's also possible to receive something that's spatially sensitive, like a map, or a diagram for a piece of machinery or something like that. Those are possible as well. For this process diagram, we would clearly state what the source is and what it shows in some sort of background statement or opening paragraph. You would then describe the process from start to finish. So obviously the start is here with this digger pulling up clay. And you'd separate the data into paragraphs as needed. I would likely group the information into 2 paragraphs, so perhaps separating the data somewhere around the halfway point where the raw materials start resembling the finished product. But you could group it as you see fit. You really do need to be dynamic, and I encourage you to do lots of practicing before you get into your examination and to receive feedback to ensure that that you're grouping data in a logical and fluent way. So as I mentioned, it's possible to see a map on your IELTS. And a candidate recently reported seeing these two maps, and they've recreated them and posted them to the forum. So I thought I would use these and just talk a little bit about, how to mentally prepare yourself in the event you receive something like this. So as we can see, the maps show an area in 1950 and that same area as it looks today, now. So sharing this as our opening statement and perhaps commenting that there appears to be some major changes between the two maps, that would be a great introduction paragraph for our response. After this introduction, I would take a paragraph to describe the first map in 1950. And I would do this in great detail. And then the second paragraph would be where I'd use heavy comparative language. So, I mean, as you can see, it's sort of similar to that question we were looking at with the two pie charts, where we are going to describe one of the pie charts in detail, and then we're going to save our comparative language for the second paragraph when we start, describing the second pie chart. It's similar to that. So, here we would describe how, there was a residential area. It looks to be like there are two, places where shipping containers can be offloaded or loaded. And then talk about this, I think it says tram. So there's a tram line that runs through the business district of the area, illustrated in the map. And then when we go to the second paragraph, talking about the map as it looks today, we would mention how a lot of these things have disappeared. The business district has grown larger, the tram has grown smaller, and there is a footbridge and some sort of stadium, and there is no more residential area. And of course, we'd be pretty much every sentence we would be using some sort of comparative transition to show how this compares to the map from 1950. So I hope that video outlines a few logical approaches regarding how to interpret data and mentally prepare yourself for the written response. In subsequent videos, we will go into more detail regarding how to recognize these broad, minor, and minute details and communicate these in written English. Good luck with your studies, and thank you for listening.